I wanted to start by asking some questions about how you got started as a cartoonist and when you first thought of yourself as a cartoonist. How did you begin in the business of cartooning?
Well, I suppose I began professionally because I won a competition, and on the back of that, started taking it seriously as a career rather than something I did in my spare time. Um, the Sunday Times, back in about '89, I think it was, ran a political cartoon competition, um, which was sort of it was all a bit strange and serendipitous because I never read the Sunday Times. I used to buy the Observer, and I went out one Sunday. I would say Sunday morning, but it was probably more like Sunday afternoon after a hard night's drinking. And the Observer was sold out, so I picked up a copy of the Sunday Times and found this competition and promptly entered and won it. And sort of on the back of that, they gave me my first job, which was standing in for Gerald Scarfe one Sunday when he was away.
So, presumably when you saw the competition, you must, in a way, have thought of yourself as able to do a political cartoon, or would you have entered any cartoon competition that you've seen on that Sunday?
No, I think I was already had the idea of being a political cartoonist. That was sort of what I was aiming at. And I'd done various other things sort of in fine art and design, and was starting looking at cartooning and illustration as a possible way to go.
Because you studied at Leeds, didn't you? Fine art at Leeds.
Yeah, I did fine art at Leeds.
Because it's interesting that fine art at Leeds, just before you went there, had produced Kipper Williams and Steve Bell. I mean, what was there something at Leeds that made this more attractive?
I don't. I think it is complete coincidence because when I started at Leeds, which was a few years after Steve and Kipper had left, there was a whole new regime. We got a new professor, quite a lot of new staff, and I think the style of teaching would have changed incredibly in those few years. So I can't really think it was anything to do with Leeds Fine Art Department. I think it was, purely coincidence.
So that wasn't an association that you made till later, presumably?
No, it was quite a long time later that I think I must have seen a biog in the back of one of Steve's books and realised he'd gone to Leeds and spoke to him about it, and then he said, well, Kipper went as well, so no, I can't see that there's any, unless soft southern boys going to big northern university suddenly became politicised or something, I don't know.
Yeah. So from winning the competition, did you start then as a freelance?
Yeah, I think at the time I won the competition, I was on the dole. I'd done all sorts of jobs, been a motorcycle dispatch rider, and I'd done all sorts of odd bits and bobs. But at the time I was on the dole, and I was really just trying to put together a portfolio of cartoons, while I had the time. And the Sunday Times rang me up and said, Gerald Scarfe's away for the next couple of weeks, could I stand in? So I thought about it, or appeared to think about it for 30 seconds before saying yes and not trying to look too eager. And, that was my first professional job, and I thought, well, I better be serious about this. So on the back of it, the Sunday Times obviously liked it enough to give me more work, and I built up work with them and started taking the portfolio around to other papers.
So which cartoonists influenced you when you were starting?
I don't know. I mean, sort of everyone and no one. There was no one cartoonist that I thought, that's the way you should be drawing cartoons. I suppose I worked pretty large, simply from the fine art background. I was a painter, so I was used to sort of drawing from the elbow and working big, and not doing this sort of little wrist and fingers bit, which is how most guys, I guess, draw with a small pen. So that sort of big sweeping style, I suppose sort of Stedman and Scarfe were a bit of an influence. Stedman more so probably than Scarfe. but at the same time, I'd sort of probably be looking at sort of Les Gibbard's work in The Guardian, which was very different, you know, very small scale, very sort of controlled. But Les's work always seemed to be so good at telling the story politically, you know, seemed to very clever ways of finding to put over, you know, often a quite complicated story in a small space. So, you know, I wasn't trying to draw like any or work like any of them, but I think I'd just be sort of a magpie picking up these bits and pieces from anything I could see or find.
That's interesting, because I'd seen interviews with you, read interviews with you before, where you talked about Les Gibbard as not as an influence, but somebody you looked at as a model. And it's interesting your styles are so different, but it was the way that he worked in telling the story, was it? That was.
Yeah, I think, and also I think he had quite a difficult job. He didn't have a regular slot like most cartoonists have, and which The Guardian later gave to Steve Bell. The cartoon would move around the paper on the news pages and go with whatever the story was he was cartooning. And of course sometimes the story moved, or was, if something happened and, you know, it might get shifted from the front page to page 6, and then he might have to rework the cartoon to a different shape. So I think, one, there was this amazing thing that he'd work in, you know, could be a long upright one day, a wide panorama the next. He'd have to fit, you know, these things in, which was just, you know, I think took a incredibly sort of just a fantastic way of working. I mean, the cartoon, the drawing is very simple with most of Les's work. There's not a massive amount of there's no colour, of course, at the time. It's black and white. It's quite simple line work, but I was just always impressed with the way he sort of got to grips with the story and put it over.
So, because a broader question that we might just pop in there, which is interesting, is what do you admire in other cartoonists? What do you admire? Is it their style, or is it their ability to produce high quality work regularly, or is it one cartoon that they've done that is superlative, or none of the above?
Well, sort of, yeah, all and none of the above. You know, I suppose it depends who it is. There are people whose artwork you admire, but sometimes think are a bit sort of lacking on the sort of political sort of savoir-faire, whatever, you know. And there are other people whose, I mean, there might even be cartoonists whose politics you hate, but you think just are very good at, you know, forging a gag out of something. So it is very varied, and I suppose the people that bring everything together are sort of few and far between.
So did you see yourself as a political animal when you were thinking of starting cartooning as a career? Was that something you had to learn, or
no? I think that's why it was political cartooning I wanted to go into, because I was very much a political animal. I was on the Union Council at university, and first job when I left Leeds, I taught art at a day centre for people with learning difficulties, and I was the local Nalgo shop steward, and so I suppose I've always been fairly politically involved. I used to draw political cartoons for the local Nalgo magazine. Basically the editorial committee was me and one other guy, you know, and he'd sit at the typewriter and bash out the articles people had sent in, and then I'd paste them up, and if there were any holes left, I'd fill them with a little cartoon. You know.
So that's politics that's very campaigning as well, isn't it? Very, very kind of involved. It's not very passive.
Yes, yeah, I'm not as active as I was, but I think I've always had that sort of left-wing campaigning thing in me.
Can I go on from there to talk about working for a publication, the process of working for a publication? Some of the cartoonists we've been talking to obviously like working in the office. They like fitting in with the paper, like the whole process of news rolling forward throughout the day and producing a cartoon that fits in with that, and then kind of going home at the end of the day. You don't work in the office. Do you see yourself as a kind of, do you need to be on the outside as a cartoonist? Do you need to be slightly maverick outside looking in, or is it? Am I weaving too much into that?
Maybe there's a little element of that, but I think there are also sort of several just much bigger practical reasons. So, I mean, one, I don't suppose the indie has anywhere for me to work. You know, the few times I haven't been in since they've been in Derry Street. Before that, the few times I did go in, it was always a matter of clearing a little space on somebody's invariably flat desk, not a slope to work on, which is very difficult, and not a separate office, so people constantly around you, which can yes, the buzz can be good, and you might sort of click off other people and pick up ideas, but also you tend to have somebody hanging over your shoulder every 5 minutes going, "Who's that then? Don't look a bit like him," So the sort of peace and quiet of working at home is important. But also, I mean, nowadays there's really not the need to be there. You've got 24-hour news on the telly, on your laptop, email, scanner. The imperative to be there isn't the same. I think you can, you can be just as au fait with what's going on. You can react just as quickly to the news being at home.
But if your paper has a news agenda, how do you make sure you fit into that? Do you phone up? Do you email during the day?
The good thing is I don't fit into their news agenda, really. I do pretty much what I want, and they mostly let me be. But we do start. I ring them about 10 in the morning, and we have a sort of very brief conversation. I mean, often it'll be just me saying, "I think I should be doing such and such today," and they say, "Okay, fine." Other days it might be, "Well, there's this story and there's that story. I'm not sure if this one's got the legs and it's still going to be big tomorrow. What do you think?" And other days it might be, "God, there's absolutely nothing going on today. Have you heard of anything? Please, So, but it's a brief conversation, and after that, I come up with an idea, work up a very quick pencil rough, and email it over to them.
So you just send them one, do you?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I never give them a choice. I mean, I think if you sort of do several roughs and give a choice, you always know which is best. There are people who do sort of 6 roughs, of which they'll probably know one is good, 2 are okay, and 3 are complete make weights. At which point somebody chooses one of the make weights, or says, "We like this one, but could we have a bit of this one in it?" And you get the sort of camel of a cartoon designed by committee. So no, I give them one, and on the very rare occasion they don't like it, I go away and think again.
So is this something that's taken a while to develop, or is this the system that you had when you started?
No, it's always been a system I've worked to. I told them from the start that I'd send one rough. Happy to think again if that didn't work, but no multiple choice.
Do you ever have situations where the news changes rapidly during the day and you get asked to do something else at the last minute?
Yes, I mean, quite often I'll just realise myself sometimes that something's happened, and which just blows whatever story you're doing off the pages. So I'll ring up and say, "Look, I think I need to change," and they said, "Oh yeah, we were thinking that too. We hadn't got around to calling you." And very occasionally something happens very late on. I mean, once or twice I've even filed the cartoon, and then something's happened, and I've got the editor on the phone saying, "Can you do another cartoon on this?" And I say, "Yes, how long have I got?" And he said, "Half an hour ago," So it's a matter of finding something very simple that can be just sketched out really, really quickly.
And what about the completed cartoon? Do you find that there are constraints? Does it have to go past the lawyers? Is libel a constraint? Do you get the editor telling you that there are problems with a particular type of approach?
Well, less and less. I think sort of. I used to have more problems with being told. It wasn't so much libel. It was more what was sort of came under the taste and decency category, and I'd sort of be told occasionally to pull Mr. Blair's trousers back up or something. But I think over the years, I mean, one, I'm sure I've got to know much more what is and what isn't acceptable to the paper, which means I know where the line is, so I just try and overstep it a little bit when I can. Until I think they've become more relaxed about what I do and slightly less worried that something might be offensive. I'm sure there's stuff which is much nearer the knuckle that I get away with now that I probably wouldn't have done a few years ago. Whether that's just a general sort of change in society, change in the way the paper views me, I don't know.
Because there have been a number of occasions on which the paper has changed or requested changes. I remember you telling me about the 1997, the pin the head on the Tory cartoon.
Yes, I mean that was a. I mean,
that's early on. I guess.
It was very early on in my career at the Independent, and it was the when it was working on the day of the 97 election for the paper of the next morning. So obviously working without the result being known. But for a cartoon which would be seen when the result was known. So it was a matter of the sort of discussion, I think, first thing in the morning was how do we take both possibilities into account, or do we just do a completely different story? And obviously the idea was, well, to ignore the general election looks sort of willfully odd, so it has to be a cartoon which, although we were both pretty certain Blair would win, took into the vague possibility that he didn't, that Major stayed in office. So the cartoon was a headless figure stood on the steps of Number 10 with the V signs, and it was a pin the head on the Tory. A Tory has just been elected, but which one? Major or Blair? So that was sort of my idea for getting around the possibilities. But I think it went out as it was in the first edition or something. But then the editor seemed to think, as the sort of scale of the Labour landslide became apparent, seemed to think it didn't fit the mood of what he thought was the mood of the evening, and obviously thought it was too cynical. So he just Tipexed out the last line of the cartoon, which it told you how to play the game, cut out the heads and stick the pin through the X in the forehead where it did least harm, and it said something along the lines of who wins? Nobody. I can't remember the exact wording, but that was blanked out as being a little too cynical and not in keeping with the mood. And I think even in the last editions the cartoon might have disappeared altogether in favour of a photo.
It's strange because with the further passage of time, that cartoon seems to be even sharper than it must have been when it was drawn. It kind of even more appropriate. But during the day, it must have felt the other way.
That's the beauty of being sort of far to the left of anybody in mainstream politics. You can be cynical and attack the whole lot of them, and are unlikely to be disappointed.
But there were other occasions. I mean, there's the cartoon of the scapegoat cartoon of Yasser Arafat,
yes,
which it's about 2000, I think, where he's tethered in the desert, and that was cut down.
That was the Taste and Decency thing rearing its head, and really it was. There was basically just a difference of opinion between the comment editor who'd seen the rough and approved it, and the editor of the paper who didn't see it until the finished artwork was on screen and about to go to press, who then sort of freaked out and said, "No, I'm not having that in my paper."
It's a wonderfully shocking image, but it's deliberately shocking, isn't
it?
Yes,
of course, yeah. But I don't know. Is it shocking? It's shocking in a bit of a sort of carry-on Donald McGill sort of a way, It's risque and a little sort of it's that sort of nudge McGill sort of humour.
It's a blunt statement on a subject around which presumably a lot of people were tiptoeing very.
Yeah,
very
I don't think the politics was the problem for the editor. It was simply the sort of phallic tank barrel sort of appearing from Sharon's groin,
But those sorts of cartoons did get you a lot of criticism coming to the paper as well.
Yes, and not
either from lobbies.
not that one because Sharon was cropped out of the
Yes,
cartoon,
yeah,
so the
yeah.
the version that went out in the paper just had Arafat as the scapegoat.
Yes, but the baby eating one.
Yes,
the
other Israeli cartoons have
yeah.
caused problems. But you've got to expect that if you do cartoons about Israel Palestine, you've got to expect it's a very
Yes.
it's a very fraught subject with where neither side has a great deal of room to listen to the opinions of the other. So any strong statement is going to.
But it's not something which discourages you from addressing that particular subject. If you sit down to do a kind of Palestinian Israeli cartoon, do you feel differently that something protest might come, or does that?
No,
does that make you more determined?
I expect protests to a
Yeah.
degree. So maybe I don't think it holds me back.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't change what I want to say. It might make me examine exactly how I say it, just in case I sort of suggest anything. There's always a possibility that you suggest things in a cartoon that aren't what you intend. You know, I mean, images can be read so many different ways by different people. There's always a certain flexibility in, the image and what it means to you and what it means to somebody reading it and how they read it. So I think maybe in those situations now I might think more carefully about any possible unintended readings to make it what I'm saying as clear as possible.
Has the internet had an impact on that? Because the cartoon that we're talking about, the one that's based on Goya's Saturn devouring one of his children, I mean that's perhaps a reference that the paper's readership in this country might be expected to pick up and to accept. But presumably the cartoon goes on the web and is seen around the world by people who haven't got that particular cultural context and might not pick up those references. Does that have an impact on the way that you work? Or is it something you just can't bother to clutter your mind with?
It's not something I spend time thinking about, because I think it would drive you mad if you worried about how you were seen wherever anybody might see The Independent. I mean, at the time, that cartoon was 2003. The cartoon wasn't on the web at the time. I mean, it was copied from the paper and put on the web by a lot of groups, across Israel and the States with all sorts of shock horror pieces. And I noticed in a lot of them, the actual bottom of the cartoon was cropped off, whether accidentally or deliberately, I don't know, but a lot of them, it cropped off the bottom of the signature where it actually said, after Goya. So, a lot of people seeing that might have missed the reference because there was nothing to clue them into it. But no, I think you have to work, not even necessarily with your readership in mind. I mean, I work for myself mostly and trust that what I find funny is going to be shared by enough of the readers. If I'm worried about what the readership of The Independent thought, I don't know how I'd get on. I mean, such a strange readership. It covers such a vast spectrum of the sort of politics. It's not. I don't think you can't pigeonhole independent readers. The Guardian sort of soaks up most of the sort of more intellectually minded left. You know where the Telegraph is based. You know what the Mirror's readership are, etc. But the Indie seems to be everything from sort of quite youthful sort of metropolitan audience, quite a big student audience, to sort of plenty of letters from sort of retired vicars in shires. Sort of. If you tried to second guess what the readership thought, you'd go mad. So no, I don't think there's too much thinking about.
Well, that's interesting, particularly interesting, because it brings us on to the next kind of group of questions that I wanted to, or the subject I wanted to talk about, which is the idea of cartoons having an impact, and whether they have an impact, what that impact is, what it might be, and also on whom they have that impact. And as you say, for whom you draw the cartoon, whether you think of the readership, whether you think of yourself, whether you think of the editorial staff, whether you think of the politicians who might be featured in it and whether they see it and how they react, and also how you know what impact they're having, if any. So do you think your work, do you work for an impact? Do you try to have an impact? If so,
yes,
do you try to change opinions? That's
yes,
one way
I think if I can't see the point of doing the job if you don't think it's going to have some impact. But I think you'd be deluded if you thought, a cartoon was going on its own was going to change minds, influence policy, and bring peace to the world or whatever. It just ain't going to happen. I think most you can hope to be sort of part of a process that enough people are putting alternative points of view or whatever to something, and that it's a sort of a drip drip Chinese water torture effect, So yes, you have your own political views that you want to put across. You hope it might change some people's minds, might influence, might just make them look at something afresh, might just make them have a different take on something, but I don't think you can expect to be, changing minds and influencing people.
What about that very particular part of the audience, the politicians themselves, the people featured in the cartoons?
Was to get up their noses and annoy them, which is mostly the idea. Let's face it. In that it's sort of I think political cartooning is for people who don't actually want to take up a rifle and sit in the book depository window. It's a sort of sniping from a much safer distance with just a small sharp pen. It doesn't do a great deal of damage, but if you prick them with it often enough, it might just rile them.
So it's heckling rather than campaigning? Is it? Kind of...
Yes, probably.
Or is it more than that?
Well, it's a little more than heckling, I hope. It is sort of Yabu sucks, the Emperor's got no clothes on, and he's got a very fat arse, and anything else you can think of to say, which might just make people look at him again and think, oh, now he comes to point that out. He hasn't got a leg to stand on. He is doing something totally ridiculous. This whole situation is farcical. What's the line? Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Yes,
I think we don't know if we do much of the first, but we definitely intend to sort of afflict the comfortable.
Do you know what impact you're having? Let's take politicians as an example. Do they ever tell you what they think about your cartoons? Do you go out of your way to find out what they think?
I don't go out of my way.
Do you go to political conferences and meet them?
No, I went and sort of cartooned at the Labour conference once, but found just the sort of the working conditions and the time very difficult. With the deadline was just too early to be able to see the speeches, go and find a space to work and turn something around. And generally, I think I mostly try and avoid mixing with politicians. I mean, I bump into them occasionally and sort of get introduced to them occasionally, and some feign to like your work, and some sort of tear you off a strip for something you've done. But I think sort of fraternising with the enemy is mostly to be avoided. I got introduced to David Davis once, and I always thought David Davis was just this sort of swivel-eyed right-wing nutter. And then I met him, and he was, I realised he was in fact, charming, urbane, swivel-eyed right-wing nutter. So yes, you can meet them and be slightly disarmed by them, which isn't a good idea.
Presumably that's part of their job, though.
Well, I'm sure it is.
Critics,
yes. I mean, some of them have seemed very bad at it. I'm surprised. I got introduced to John Reed once, and he had a go at me because I'd drawn him with a cigarette in the corner of him. I drew him as a Glasgow hard man, a little cigarette clamped to his bottom lip. And he started sort of ranting really and saying, "Oh, I gave up smoking years ago. You can't do that, draw me with a cigarette. No. And it was a one-off gag, but of course, having complained, every time I drew him, he had the fag in the corner of his mouth after that, and it's so foolish to ever complain to a cartoonist about how they portray you, because you know it's just going to get worse, you know.
Like Gordon Brown complaining about being drawn fat.
Yes, I don't know if he was really complaining. I think it was just Gordon not knowing what to say when introduced to a cartoonist, and it was his sort of stock. I think it was meant to be his stock funny line. Again, somebody introduced me to him at an independent do and said, "Oh, Gordon, this is Dave Brown, the cartoonist." And he said, "Oh, yes, I know your work. You make me far too fat." And that was it. I didn't even get a chance to reply, because with that his mind just whisked him away and he was out the door and gone. But then I heard a little while later that Martin Rowson had met him and he'd said exactly the same thing to him. So I think it's a sort of a way to disarm the cartoonist with a slight joke at your own expense, and then hopefully get away with that before the conversation gets any more difficult. So I can't imagine he was bothered about how he was drawn. He wasn't a man that looked like he spent a great deal of time on his appearance and worrying about those sort of things.
And do cartoonists try to buy the originals?
Politicians, occasionally.
Sorry, politicians. Yeah.
Occasionally, less and less so. I think sort of the new Labour set of ministers were particularly poor at wanting to buy cartoons. I don't think many of them were cartoon fans. I think it was a sort of much more the much older school of sort of high Tories who probably had vast palatial manor houses with walls to fill, you know. But not many buy. I mean, backbenchers who suddenly get featured, you know, who aren't well-known faces will go out of their way to buy a cartoon because it may be the only one that, you know, that has them in before they return to the backbenches and obscurity. But no, mostly. Maybe they buy a lot of other cartoonists' work, and you know, they either just don't like mine or they're just too offensive. That would be quite nice if that was the case.
And how about responses from readers? Do they come in?
Yes, I get some.
Like things?
It is strange because you work from home and you do mostly work in isolation, and you don't always know how a cartoon's gone down. I mean, the thing I always say is that you get sort of two sorts of letters. You get the letters from people who like your work, and they write to Dave Brown, care of The Independent, and then the letter is just readdressed and sent to me, so nobody at The Independent sees it, and it says, "Dear Dave Brown, loved whatever it was," which is fine. Or the other sort, they don't like the cartoon and they write to the editor, and so the editor gets to see it, and it's, "Dear Sir, your cartoonist," never the name, "your cartoonist has done the most appalling, shocking, disgusting, whatever." So the editor must get a sort of slightly one-sided view of what the readers think, but you know, I haven't been sacked yet, so hopefully that doesn't matter too much.
There's another group of questions I'd like to deal with now, to ask you, which is about how you like to work and how you get the idea, that horrible question that people ask cartoonists, but how you start your day, how you develop the cartoon, and how you produce the physical cartoon at the end. So how do you get the idea, and how do you get the reference material that you need to work on the cartoon?
Well, I mean, firstly, the idea of what the topic should be is simply from looking at, you know, myriad sources of news in the morning. You know, Today programme on the radio, you know, 24-hour news on the telly, and a pile of newspapers. So, you know, the day starts with really just sort of absorbing lots of news and seeing not only what's going on, but what's going to be important, trying to sort of look forward to what's going to be important the next morning, you know, almost 24 hours time when the paper's opened. So that's the first thing, I guess. But then having decided on a topic, it's sort of a matter of sitting at a drawing board in front of a blank sheet of paper and staring stupidly at it.
Is that something that's still intimidating to you? Is it?
No, it's not intimidating. It can be frustrating when it's sort of several hours have passed and you're still staring and nothing is happening. But I've got out of the, you know, I've long past sort of panicking, which I might have done years ago over that, and just sort of, I have sort of, if things really aren't working, if ideas really aren't coming, I have sort of various little techniques, to try and sort of jog something into my head, and if all else fails, the best thing is to get up and go and do something else for 5 minutes and make a cup of tea and come back and sit down again, which is remarkable how often an idea happens just as you're making the cup of tea. And a friend of mine, Martin Turner, who cartoonist for the Irish Times, said once everybody on the Irish Times had somebody on job placement or something, or somebody from last year at school to come and shadow them for a day to see what they did, to learn something about the newspaper business. And he works from home as well, so they sent somebody to his house to learn what a cartoonist did for the day. And he said the guy saw him sitting at a drawing board doing nothing for about 2 hours, and then got up and said, "Do you want a cup of tea?" Went off to make him and this kid a cup of tea, and came back and said, "That's it, you might as well go home, I've had the idea now." So there is nothing to see really, There is somebody just sitting there and pondering. It's a very odd job.
And when you start the physical creation, what do you have? Do you work on paper, board?
Yeah, I work on a sort of heavyish watercolour paper.
Do you rough it out in pencil first and then?
Yes, I mean I've usually done a very small, well, the same size as the printed cartoon pencil rough on a little sheet of layout paper just to send the paper. But then I've got an A3 sheet of watercolour paper, draw up the box as it were, and start penciling it in rough. So I've already had the design, in my head and the quick rough, and then pencil in and sort of finesse it. And then once I'm happy with that, it's dip pen and Indian ink for the line work. And when that's dry, rub out the pencil and watercolour for the colour.
And have you always worked in colour, or did colour come in very early in your career?
Nearly all the work when I started off was black and white. Occasionally I'd get some colour work, but mostly black and white. And then since I've been working for the Indie, it was colour some days and not the other, and I'd find out in the morning what page it was on and whether there was a colour or a black and white page. Sometimes, of course, it might change during the day, which could be annoying if you'd done something where the colour was actually part of the gag, and
yes.
Seeing that something was red might be important, and suddenly the pagination of the paper changes and you find you're on a black and white page, so that could be awkward. But say the last few years have been colour throughout the paper, so that's not a problem. It's always colour now.
So you've been able to settle down into a style appropriate to...
Yes,
because the colour in your cartoons is very, very vibrant and very bright and very significant to the cartoon. I mean, it seems to work very well.
Yes, I mean, I occasionally slip back into black and white, but only where I think it's going to have more impact. I sometimes miss black and white because I think black and white itself can have a very strong look on a page. But
is the pressure to work in colour? Could you drop in a black and white one?
I could, if I justified that it had more impact than colour. But I think the paper certainly like you to use the colour if possible. I mean, I occasionally do black and white, particularly if it's, say, a pastiche of an old photograph.
Yes.
I might work, and if the photo is black and white, I'll work in black and white to give the sense and the reference to the original picture. And I did once have somebody ring up from the paper saying, "Oh, was the file wrong, or was it meant to be black and white?" He obviously didn't recognise, unfortunately, the original picture. But yes, it's mostly colour now. I've got used to using colour. And I think on occasion I use quite a sort of polarised two-colour thing, which maybe has the same strength as black and white, but can give you that sort of, very heavy chiaroscuro to give the impact of black and white.
Are there any particular politicians you enjoy drawing, or you have enjoyed drawing? Are there any that you've had difficulty capturing?
Well, I think you've always sort of slightly bizarrely, you enjoy drawing the ones you hate most. So sort of someone like Bush, but also they're the ones that you draw more often. So it's I don't know which way it works, but the people you draw more often are the ones who are obviously most in the news. So people begin to recognise them, which means you can push your caricature further without it getting lost. People will still know who it is. So Blair, Bush, Thatcher, I mean, they're all, well, we think of them as all having very strong images. But I think when all of them started, they were fairly much unknowns, and you do wonder what you're going to get to grips with. Major was another. Major, particularly, people thought, what is there to draw in Major? He's such a dull, grey man. But in fact, more you started drawing, the more you found. And there was this sort of fantastically strange top lip with this ingrowing moustache, as somebody once described it, And Major was fantastic to draw. And his very sort of greyness obviously became a thing. I mean, for Spitting Image, he was literally grey, wasn't he? So Blair started off as Bambi, as a rather sort of cuddly, soft, very bland-looking figure. But we sort of soon realised he had this sort of array of teeth, and the fantastic flapping ears. So it's drawing them over and over again that sort of creates the caricature and means you can stretch that a bit further.
Do cartoonists work as a pack, developing these caricatures? I mean, do you look at each other's work?
Yeah, I'm sure.
See the way that everything's going.
Everybody looks at other people's work, and you can't help be influenced to a degree by it. And you'll look and think, and maybe see something that somebody else has picked up on that you hadn't spotted, and vice versa. And I suppose there is sometimes a bit of a consensus that obviously we all look at these people a lot and sit down and draw them a lot, so we notice what are the features that you can stress and exaggerate and what things don't work.
I'm not saying you copy off each other or that's a bad thing, but if you look at American cartoons of Blair, they are quite similar to each other, but they're nothing like British cartoons of Blair. Kind of German Mrs. Thatcher is recognisable in Germany, but
yes. Well, I don't think. I think our sort of, say, Blair cartoon wouldn't be recognisable outside of this country because it is quite extreme. It's not. If you were one of those sort of pavement caricaturists, and this man then totally unknown, Tony Blair, came and sat next to you, and you drew him as I sort of was drawing him at the end of his reign. People would say, well, this is nothing like him. You have to have that familiarity both with the cartoons and with the subject till you see both sort of coming together and meeting somewhere in the middle. So it is going to be different for different countries who don't have the same familiarity and just exposure to the same cartoonists.
Is that an attractive thing about newspaper cartooning, that you have a readership that will have seen the cartoon you did yesterday, and you can expect them to have seen last month's and last year's image of the same person? You kind of take them with you while you refine.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great things about doing the cartoon daily. You can do something. You can do something one day. You can pick up on it again the next day or the next week, and and have a little bit of a motif going that. Eventually, having maybe explained it, having been a very specific reason for it in the first cartoon, which you then might refer back to in another cartoon, but which eventually has a life of its own and exists outside, may exist completely outside its original meaning, and just sort of becomes a sort of a motif for the person.
So with a change of government, do you miss politicians who've disappeared, or do you just look forward to getting your teeth into the new lot and beginning the process again?
Yeah, I think you occasionally sort of realise you missed them a bit. Occasionally when somebody pops back into the news after sort of not having drawn them for a while, you think, oh, quite fun to draw Thatcher again or Blair, whoever it is. But no, mostly I think you get to the point where you realise you've sort of drawn them to death, if not quite literally.
Yes.
And yes, there will always be another bunch of idiots along to replace them, which means, yes, you have to start the process off again, and the first cartoons are probably quite portrait-like up to a point.
Yes.
until people start getting used to them. And if they're Nick Clegg, they're still a big empty sort of nothing of a face with a slightly recognisable haircut. You know.
Can we go on then to a question which kind of flows on from some of what we've been talking about, the idea of cartoonists in a country maybe working together, enjoying each other's work, enjoying each other's styles, and is there a national tradition in cartooning? Do you feel yourself to be working within a British tradition of cartooning that you can look back to Gilray and say, you know, there is a theme, there's a set of common approaches going through? Or do you just, or is that something which is imposed on it by people like me?
I suppose that is to an extent there is a tradition that you're aware of. And yes, it's easy to say Gilray is a sort of starting point, and maybe it's easy for quite a few recent and current cartoonists to look back at Gilray and see something in common. But in between, there's probably 100 years of cartooning where Gilray was probably out of fashion and cartoonists didn't take very much notice of him at all. So that might rather sort of blow the idea of a continuous tradition apart. I don't know, but I think maybe, from the 60s, you got cartoonists who were deliberately harking back to a sort of a more, sort of a ruder, more rumbustious sort of age, and whether they were looking at Gilray directly, there was certainly something of his sort of appetite for the sort of the gross image coming back into fashion, I suppose, after a long period of rather restrained and quite polite cartooning.
Do you see British cartooning as uniquely different from American cartooning, say French or German cartooning? Is there now a British tradition, or is it just, do you look across other countries and see similar work being done?
I guess we all have different histories as countries cartooning, so I suppose I don't know, I guess American cartoonists will occasionally look back at sort of Thomas Nast or something. Well, the fact that they still, today I've actually done a Republican elephant, that's one of Nast's creations. So I guess in that respect, American cartoonists very much have the tradition of Nast with the elephant and the donkey, whether they even know where it came from or not. That's something which has made a tradition over there. So there are things, a lot of British cartoonists, we still use the cart horse, for the TUC, that's a David Lowe creation. So there are things we pick up on in a quite deliberate way, but whether the tradition exists outside of us sort of paying lip service to it, I don't know.
Because, of course, a lot of your work has a fine art tradition and refers to painters, illustrators, rather than cartoonists.
Yes, that's a sort of specific little thread for one cartoon I do a week, a pastiche of an old master painting. But I wouldn't sort of pretend that actually put me into some tradition of mainstream British painting,
Well, let's turn around and look the other way, because it doesn't seem terribly profitable to look in that direction, but to look forward and ask what's going to happen. Do you have a sense, an idea of what's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years, perhaps even a shorter time scale to newspaper, to news cartooning, because we're facing so much change that if your work and the way that you work is recognisable in a tradition that goes back to Gilray, is that going to change completely? Do you think cartoonists are going to give up this physical process of working with paper and pen to produce cartoons that are for not a paper-based medium at all?
Well, there are big problems because nobody really knows where newspapers are going, apart from they're disappearing in as much as they're losing sales. But everybody sees the future as being digital and online, but nobody within the industry knows quite how to make that pay at the moment. So there's the general problem for the newspaper industry about declining sales and how do they make a online version of a newspaper pay. Obviously, cartoons are already online in this site as well as in the paper. I take a little account of that in as much as the image online isn't as clearly readable as the printed image. So anything where there's any small text within the image, I've noticed some years ago, that text has to be quite a bit bigger to be readable. You can't do things in quite as small detail as you can in the paper. So it's affected me in that way. Cartooning, yes. I mean, if papers go to a purely digital format, I think there'll still be a role for cartoons, but it might be a little different. The style might have to be a little simpler. Whether that means you have to work in a digital medium rather than with pen and ink, I think that's still the choice of the cartoonist. I mean, some cartoonists already are using either all digital, either all sort of Photoshop or elements of it. You know, some are doing their basic line drawing and then colour using Photoshop.
What about movement? I mean, is it something you'd be interested in?
Yeah, well, yes, of course. Some are doing short animations. There still seems to be a problem with that because, I mean, I know a few people who do that, and it takes so much longer. Yeah. They can't respond. They're mostly doing maybe 1 or 2 animations a week for papers, you know, which means you have to pick a story which has got more legs on it. You can't respond as quickly. So I think that's going to be limited. I think there's a place for it, but it doesn't really replace the single frame cartoon. Because it just can't respond to the news quickly enough.
But the prospect of moving onto the web is something which, does it appeal to you, appall you?
The prospect of sort of not having a inky pen in my fingers appalls me. The idea of moving a mouse around. One, because I'm not computer literate enough to be able to do it, I think, and two, at least the examples I've seen so far, I find a bit soulless. Yes, you might be able to, you know, click on several things and get sort of various watercolour effects. But I mean, you know, I can pick up the brush I want, zap, pick up the next one. You know, where making choices online, as far as I see, is not a time saver. It's going to be a lot slower, and it'll never have the sort of same effect that I can have with a brush. There are random things that happen with sort of working with watercolour and ink, you know, bits where the nib sticks in the paper and you got at the end of a fast line you get a little flick of ink, which you might choose to paint out if it's not where you want it, but you might leave in. It leads a certain sort of speed and aggression to the way you've drawn. There's a sort of authenticity about all those little accidents which you can choose to incorporate or not, which I really can't see happening, you know, in a digital format. So no, I couldn't. You know, but if by the time paper disappears completely, I think I'll be long gone. So I'm not too worried by that. When all the trees have gone.
Thank you very much.